Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed. I'm Arjuna, and this is the channel where Eastern theology meets Western skepticism. Today I've got Liz Jackson on. She's a philosophy professor at Ryerson University. Have I got that right?
Yep,
And
that's right.
what are your
Ryerson.
subjects that you teach or research on?
Yeah, my research is in basically two main areas. So epistemology, sort of questions about knowledge and justified or rational belief. Really interested in sort of the nature of belief, what makes a belief rational, kind of all centers on the question, what should we believe? But I'm also really interested in philosophy of religion, and there I would say my research is mainly about the rationality of a religious commitment. So what makes either, practicing a religion, so more of an action-oriented thing, or I take belief to be a kind of commitment as well. What could make that rational? What makes that rational over time? And there, my work is mainly in kind of the nature and rationality of faith, and then also Pascal's wager. So a lot of my teaching also centers around these topics. I also teach critical thinking, which is kind of, argument identification and analysis, is kind of a fun class I get to teach to Ryerson undergrads, but most of my teaching is also in those same areas.
Right. My brother actually went to university at Ryerson. I think he did biology and computer science, a double bachelor's, which people ask if it's related, but I think he says it's not. But somewhat of a small world. I actually grew up in Canada, in Vancouver.
Yeah, that's great. No, it's funny. I think a lot of Americans I talk to have never heard of Ryerson, but it's a massive university. I think there's
Right.
something like 50,000 students. So most Canadians are like, of course, Ryerson, but it's just not, I guess, not something a lot of Americans have heard of. But yeah, that's awesome. Your brother went there.
Right. So I thought we could start by I could give a basic version of Pascal's wager, which Prabhupada gave. Prabhupada's the founder of the Hare Krishna movement in the West, which meant he transplanted the traditional Vaishnava, Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition into the West. And he would argue something like, so what if it's not true? We're having a nice dream. Basically Krishna consciousness is fun. We're dancing and feasting. So even if it's not true, you're missing out. But if it is true, then we're having a nice dream. We're dancing and feasting, and we've got a nice destination. So I guess that's kind of a similar form to Pascal's wager, but I think you get this added thing that it's also great now, even if it's not true. Not just that, well, if it's not true, there's some cost, but you're gambling. You're taking a calculated risk. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, no, it's good. So it's interesting. I mean, there's different versions of Pascal's wager, and I think this applies in the Christian case as well, although I have questions about Hare Krishna and some of the theology and teachings there. But, you can kind of make a version of the wager that applies to just the afterlife. So you're really just focusing on heaven or hell or reincarnation or whatever, afterlife is relevant, given the religions you're considering. Or you can make one that actually appeals to this life, like our current earthly life and the afterlife. And so it sounds like his version was kind of one that appealed to both of those. One thing that's interesting about the Christian tradition, I mean, I kind of go back and forth on this because on the one hand, there is studies that show, I mean, maybe not even Christians specifically, but religious people tend to be happier and healthier and less likely to get divorced. I don't know that those studies are actually about Christians specifically. It could apply to other religions as well. But for Christians specifically, the Bible does say that, we should expect hardship and persecution in this life, and we shouldn't just expect things to be just wonderful all the time. So I do kind of, I'm not sure how I think about this appealing to earthly benefits in the Christian case. Like, is that consistent with what the Bible teaches about what this life will be like for Christians? But it's interesting to hear. It sounds like the version that maybe appeals to both this life and the afterlife seems like it could fare well when you're talking about Hare Krishna. Would you agree with that?
I like that point. I hadn't actually thought about it in the context of prosperity doctrine. So, I mean, I assume you disagree with prosperity doctrine, which is why you brought it up. I find most of the YouTubers and philosophy of religion people on the scene or that I follow, they reject prosperity doctrine. It seems to be the uneducated Christians that embrace it. Would that be accurate?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Like, I haven't looked at studies or anything, so I don't want to say I'm positive, but I think basically anecdotally that seems right to me. I think I even think just looking at the Bible and taking it seriously seems to count against prosperity doctrine. So I don't think you even have to, I think you just need to look at the Bible and take it seriously. You don't have to be like educated to a certain degree or whatever. But yeah, I think you're right about that.
Well, that would be consistent with the idea, because if it's not supported by the Bible, then it's not surprising that all the people that are doing serious philosophy of religion don't accept it. So
right.
That's something I really respect, because in Christian consciousness, there's also a rejection of prosperity doctrine. I mean, you do get things there. There are stories of people becoming successful because they got God's mercy, through their devotional service. But there's also, at the other end of it, people who didn't get material prosperity, but they got a different kind of mercy. So when we say you're better off being Krishna conscious and not being Krishna conscious, we don't necessarily mean that you'll have good health or big bank balance, but you will have a kind of happiness or bliss that transcends that. So it's like, what does it actually take to be happy in all circumstances? Because if your happiness comes from prosperity, if you're happy because you have a nice bank balance and you have your health and nice family and friends, then all it takes is a bit of dysentery and your health's gone. It doesn't take much to lose your wealth. I mean, one divorce can cost somebody 50% of their wealth, and that's just one life event, and for even the richest people in the world, that they can have it all taken away through a series of events. So it's described that with material wealth, you're either hankering for it, or you've got it and it didn't bring the happiness which you thought it was going to bring, or you've got it but you're worried it's going to be gone soon, or someone's going to take it away. So the kind of prosperity, were prosperity doctrine true, that wouldn't even be a way to a deep kind of happiness anyway. The word happiness might fall short here too, because often we associate happiness with this kind of materialistic pleasure or sense of comfort. But what we're talking about here is something that transcends that even if everything's taken away, like the kind of happiness that a saintly person could have when they're living in complete austerity, or someone that's doing welfare work but is not themselves living comfortably, the kind of happiness they could have.
Yeah, no, that's a really nice point. So maybe we need to distinguish between either different kinds of happiness or different kinds of, prosperity is a tough word too, because then we tend to think of the wealth and the bank account and the health and all that stuff. But I do think there's a sense in which being religious gives you hope and gives you a purpose. And I'm not saying that non-religious people can't ever have that at all, but definitely thinking like there's an afterlife where I'll see my loved ones again and there's a God who's taking care of me. That's going to give you some kind of good benefits in this life. And benefits, again, it's a hard word, but I think you get what I'm saying. It's in some way like a deeper benefit than just, like having a bunch of money or something. So that might actually be a nice way to kind of resurrect this version of the wager that says, well, in this life you get hope and you get at least the possibility of a relationship with God, and you get this comfort that God's taking care of you. And so, your life is better before death. And then, obviously we appeal to the afterlife as well. So I like that.
Somebody might say back to that then it becomes unfalsifiable, because whether somebody takes to theism and gets material prosperity or doesn't get material prosperity, you'll just say that they're getting some other kind of benefit in a non-measurable way. But I do think that there would be something measurable. Like if somebody is actually developing pure love of God, then they should be the kind of person who can have a successful marriage. Like a lot of the time a marriage breaks down because everybody's just trying to fill their tank rather than tuning into the other person's needs and just being satisfied with their lot in life and just doing what they can to improve things and serve God from the situation they're in. Whereas, the person who's trying to fill their tank materially, trying to get material pleasure, they might think, oh, I'm not getting it here anymore. Let me go look for somewhere else.
Yeah. And I think in a way it's a problem for everyone. Happiness is super difficult to quantify. I think no one would argue that happiness just like directly correlates with the amount of money you have. But also there's really interesting studies that show that happiness doesn't automatically correlate with physical health either. And a lot of people with disabilities reporting that they're actually really satisfied and happy and thankful for their disability. And so, I think in a way, measuring happiness is just a tough good. And I don't think anyone wants to assume that just money or physical health is like the ultimate measure. So I think I hear the objection, but I think in a way it's a problem for anyone who's trying to measure happiness.
Right. I think that point you made about people with disabilities is a good way of addressing the problem of evil too, because if this, I mean, it looks horrible seeing people with disabilities and so on, but if they're actually grateful for them and feel they get some benefit from it, then how can you say it's evidence of God being evil?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting argument. So, one way that people have put it in some of the disability literature is that there's two views of disability. One view, and maybe this is like I think a lot of people's default view, especially if you're not disabled, is that they're bad differences. So having a disability detracts from your well-being, it makes you worse off, and it's not just because people discriminate against people with disabilities, but something about the disability itself makes you worse off. And then there's the mere difference view, which says that disabilities are differences, but they don't automatically by themselves detract from well-being. And one thing, I think you're right. I think it's really interesting that like, if we think even like some disabilities are mere differences, you don't even have to say all of them, but the more disabilities that are mere differences, I think this can kind of like lessen the amount of evil in the world. And so yeah, I think this is a really interesting argument. I mean, obviously, there's still going to be other evils that need to be explained that aren't, don't come down to disabilities, but you can kind of narrow the amount of evil or narrow the scope of the problem of evil in a way that I think is really interesting.
Well, I think the same principles would likely apply to many different kinds of suffering, like natural disasters, all sorts of things. I mean, it's quite common people, well, maybe it's not so common. I mean, I think we're kind of getting into another topic, but it's interesting anyway. Like something that is seemingly a negative that happens to you, if you respond to it in the right way, you might find there's a silver lining, like there's some wisdom you can gain from it, or some bad quality in your heart that can be taken away if you respond to it nobly and ask God, what is it that I need to learn from the situation, rather than just thinking, oh, here's another bad thing happening in my life, and just become bitter about it. And with regards to the problem of evil, you could say, well, some people, they don't respond appropriately and they don't learn the lesson, but maybe God is doing the right thing by giving them the opportunity to grow and learn. If they don't take advantage of that, that's not God's problem. God can't force us to act in a certain way. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think what you're kind of getting at is starting to remind me of the soul-making theodicy, which is that God allows evils to sort of build our character. And I think there's like maybe two different types of theodicies here. One is this idea that this thing that we thought was bad in and of itself actually isn't bad in and of itself. And you could maybe make that argument for certain kinds of disabilities. A second is that, let's take a concrete example. Let's say someone has cancer, but that cancer ends up making their character grow a lot, and they develop all these virtues, and they get closer to their friends and family, and maybe there's a bunch of good things that come out of them having cancer. I think that's different because we don't want to claim that the cancer itself is a good thing, but that it leads to these good things. So you kind of get what I'm saying. Like with a disability case, it's like blindness isn't actually a bad thing in and of itself. With the soul-making case, it's like cancer is still bad, but it leads to something good.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I meant to address that earlier, that we still want to say that like a disability or something is bad. But I mean, this might get into something that someone could call victim blaming, but it's like Prabhupada talked about 3 classes of intelligence. First class is intelligence. You tell the child, don't put your hand in the fire or you'll get burnt. Second class intelligence, you tell the child watches another child gets burnt and learns to never put his own hand in fire. Third class intelligence, is told, sees somebody else do it, and then does it himself, gets burned, and then never puts his hand in fire again. And then 10th class intelligence, puts his hand in fire, gets burnt, repeat, get drunk, hungover, never going to do this again, repeat the next weekend over and over again. And then, so in this way, you can say that, like if some disaster happens to me, or, like I get bad health or whatever, I can say, sure, this is a bad thing, but it's actually what I need in order to learn and grow as a person. And I mean, I guess you might not want to go too far with this, because it could be that some people are actually just saintly and they're just going through what everyone goes through in the material world, or God's putting them through things in order to teach people the character of a saintly person and how they react in these different situations. It's not because they have some bad quality that needs to be removed. So there's other angles to add to it. But in my own case, I might think, like, there's this one verse in Bhagavatam which basically says we should see the bad things that happen to us as reactions for our past misdeeds. There's a few other points in the verse, but it basically saying by having this non-bitter attitude where you respond to things in your life, like, this is actually my fault, I take responsibility for this, and I need this to grow and learn as a person, then that's actually your ticket back to Godhead, that attitude.
Yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying. I guess maybe two things in response. So one is, like, when you actually look at least what some disabled people say, like what they self-report, they actually don't just say that their disability is a good thing because it leads to good things, but they actually just say that it's not a bad thing in and of itself. It's like a difference. So they would compare disability to, like, race or gender. Like, they're different, their bodies are different, but they actually think that's not necessarily a bad thing. So I hear you. One way to make a related point would be to say that disabilities lead to good things. But I think some of these people, and this is contentious, so I don't, you would need to defend this, but some people try to argue that disabilities themselves are neutral. They don't automatically detract from well-being. So anyway, that's one way to narrow the problem of people. And then the other way is obviously to, like, argue they lead to good things. We already made that distinction. But the second thing I was going to say is that, I definitely think, like, taking bad things that happen to us and asking how we can learn and grow from them is, like, a really good mindset to have. But I also don't think that, and I don't know if you were suggesting this or not, but that, like, bad things that happen to us are always, like, some kind of punishment or caused by bad things that we do. So it's not like I got cancer because I, like, have some vice or, like, did some bad thing in the past. I don't think that's what you were suggesting, but maybe you could clarify that.
Well, we can't really know why things are happening to us, but the basic principle is there that there's something that I need to learn from this. I mean, I've heard one Hare Krishna intellectual she made quite a compelling case for it. As Urmila, or Dr. Edith Best, who I've had on the channel once, she talks about how, like, when something, when you're experiencing a certain behavior from other people, it's because you're doing that same behavior, like a bad behavior. There's a way in which you're doing that to other people. And she did say for non-devotees, it could be from something you've done in a previous life, of course, bringing in reincarnation to which is a part of the Hare Krishna theology. But for people who are taking shelter of God, and this wouldn't just be Hare Krishna, this would be people who are sincerely trying to serve God in any faith, then it's more direct and personally managed by God. So if you're getting a reaction, it's because of something you've done and are still doing. And she had, like, I can't remember the example she gave, but she had a few examples where, like, people kept doing things to her that were negative, and she kept thinking, like, why am I having to experience this? And then, like, she finally, like, went to God and asked, why is this happening? And then, like, someone came and explained to her something she'd done to someone else recently, like, like, you've done this to my friend or something. And then she's like, clicked, oh, this is the way in which I'm doing something similar to someone else. And then she stopped doing that. She changed her behavior, and she stopped receiving that same kind of behavior herself.
Yeah, I definitely think that can apply. I also think we can have a tendency to see flaws in other people that are actually our own flaws as well. Like, we tend to be really critical of other people when they're doing things that we do, even if we're blind to the fact that we're doing it. So I definitely think that's true. But I think I just want to resist this claim that, like, all hardship or all bad things that happen to people are ultimately because of something bad that they did. And I mean, I agree with you that if you believe in reincarnation, that adds a different wrinkle to everything and maybe could make that claim more plausible. And maybe this is just because we're kind of coming from different faiths, but I do think the Bible is pretty explicit. I think there's a verse that says the rain falls on the godly and the ungodly, meaning bad stuff happens to everyone, and it's not always because of your actions. So this might just be a place where the faiths sort of come apart.
No, I mean, you do get that, because even great saints in our tradition, might have bad eyesight, or, like, might get kidney failure at an early age, or, if it's not that, like by being a Hare Krishna, you can eat really unhealthy and expect to not get lifestyle illnesses. So that would be consistent. If it's still that if you want to live a long, healthy life, you need to exercise. It's not just by like giving everything to God and having no bad qualities in your heart that you can like eat unhealthy and never exercise and expect to live long and healthy. So that, we're all in the same material world, and there are things that apply. Like, if you're living in a city and you're a great devotee of God and there's a natural disaster, it's not like the natural disaster is not going to happen just because you happen to live there or something like that. So there is a degree of that. But we can still ask, why did God put me in this situation? What does he want me to do here? What does he want me to learn from this? Rather than just thinking, it's just like the cruel face of the material energy. We can actually see God's hand in it. There's one nice analogy of a potter. That a lot of the analogies you get from our tradition aren't really relevant. Probably the Christian tradition too, because people don't farm or make things with their hands anymore. So the potter with one hand is smashing the pot to shape it, but the other hand is inside the pot, stopping it from breaking. So we can see God in that way, that there's one hand inside propping us up, filling us with love and keeping us strong, and another hand on the outside shaping us.
That's really beautiful. There is in the Bible uses the analogy of the potter, but I don't think it's that specific about it. And I really like that. God sort of challenging us and pushing us to grow in character, but also at the same time, God's got us, God's got our back, and he's not going to push us beyond what we can handle. So I like that a lot. That's beautiful.
It's really good for education too, right? Like, some teachers or parents or can be really firm, but the people who can do that and be really firm are the people who are also extremely loving. Whereas if somebody else tries to be firm in the same way, but isn't loving, the kids or students are not going to respond to it. They won't get the result.
Yep, I totally agree. The Bible actually talks about this too, that we have to balance grace and truth is one way it's put, where you have to, show people grace and show them love, but also like sometimes you just got to tell them what they need to hear, So it's like going too far in one direction is bad. There's like a balance between the two. So that's cool. Sounds like another potential parallel between Christianity and Hare Krishna religion.
Yeah, there's a lot of parallels. I mean, when I had David Bentley Hart on, I thought it was fun to say, we can just look at, all the versions of other religions that line up with, my own religion, and then just say that's the one true version of that religion.
There's a way in which you can affirm other religions by just taking the subset or like the overlap or whatever overlaps with what you already believe. That's funny.
Mean, that's a funny way of putting it, but I think there's some validity to looking at other religions and finding parallels and saying, well, if my religion's true, then this part of this other religion's true and is also inspired by God.
Yeah, no, that's cool. So Hare Krishnas believe in reincarnation. Do they believe that reincarnation ever stops? Like, are you reincarnated indefinitely? Or I guess I'm partially asking just because we are kind of talking about Pascal's wager, and a big part of the wager, we've been talking a lot about the earthly benefits of it, but a big part of the wager involves the afterlife. And so it would be interesting, to find out like how long does reincarnation go on for? Is this like an infinite thing or not?
So we discussed one of the main differences. Now this would be the second main difference between Christian versions of the wager and a Hare Krishna version of the wager. So the difference here being that on the Christian version, often it's argued that the cost of not wagering on God, if God does exist, is infinite. But in Krishna consciousness, the cost of not wagering on God, if God does exist, and Krishna consciousness is true, is that you spend more time in the material world suffering. So it's kind of like you have a chance to get out now. If you waste it, you're just going to spend more time here until you get another chance. So it could be that you live an animalistic life. So if you get a body in your next life that matches your state of consciousness at the time of death. So if your state of consciousness is like that of an animal, then you will get an animal body. So someone who's obsessed with eating meat might become a tiger. Some people with different obsessions will get different bodies, and there's some degree of punishment, you could say, but it's there to teach a lesson. It's not just like punishment for the sake of punishment. It's soul building, and then so people who are making proper use of their human form of life could get a human life again. Or if you're really pious, you could go to the heavenly planets where there's not really much chance of taking shelter of God because there's too much enjoyment there. This earthly realm has the perfect amount of suffering and enjoyment for us to the suffering helps us remember our position and remember our need to take shelter of God, and the pleasures of the world make us peaceful and so on. If you got the wrong balance, then you can't take to God consciousness. If you're just suffering all the time, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, too much pleasure or too much suffering, and you can't think about God. So this world is the perfect place for it. So while you're here, you best take advantage of it. And if you try and don't make it, then you'll take birth again. So basically, you'll take birth again repeatedly in the cycle of samsara until you eventually get out of here. But you'll only get out of here when you figure out that you want to get out of here and you start searching for God, or searching for the absolute truth. But assuming the truth of Krishna consciousness, that will take you to finding God.
Yeah, the balance between pleasure and suffering thing, that's also kind of a response to the problem of evil. Maybe again related to the soul building thing, but that's interesting. But yeah, so it sounds like, tell me if I'm understanding correctly, there's not really a hell in the sense of infinitely a thing that's bad that you're in for an infinite period of time. No. There's just these finite but bad things. However, on the flip side of things, the positive benefit of it would be good and infinitely good. Like if I forget what you said, when you leave this earth and you go to another planet, is that what you said?
So returning to the spiritual world, the spiritual world is probably better to phrase it the other way. The material world is a perverted reflection of the spiritual world. So anything that we get any kind of pleasure for or have any attraction to in the material world is a perverted reflection of something in the spiritual world. So
interesting. So it is kind of like heaven then. It's not a physical place. Is that right?
It depends what you mean by physical. We separate the material energy. If by physical you mean having forms and and colors and being able to dance and eat and feast, then it will be physical. But if by physical you mean composed of atoms, then no.
Okay, gotcha. Interesting. Yeah, and I guess in the Christian case it's complicated too, because the thought is that if you die right now, there's some kind of this is controversial too, but I think the majority view is non-physical place that your soul goes temporarily. Physical in the sense of like made of atoms or whatever. But then I think Christians actually teach that God will renew the earth, and ultimately we will live forever on a renewed version of the earth. So I think ultimately we will end up in a physical place. But yeah, it's interesting to kind of compare the two. But yeah, so it sounds like it would be parallel to a version of Christianity, not perfectly parallel, but in terms of Pascal's wager, that does have heaven, but then is some kind of annihilationist view, which says that maybe there's some kind of negative effects if you don't, commit to God or believe in God and God exists. But then, and I guess would you say, so like, what if someone just perpetually doesn't follow God and perpetually doesn't like see God's purpose for them? Are they just reincarnated forever, or do they cease to exist at some point?
No, they never cease to exist. Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor all these kings, nor in the future will any of them cease to be.
So are you just perpetually reincarnated?
Yeah. The soul can't be destroyed in any way, and the soul's always existed. So you would be perpetually reincarnated. However, bhakti, which means devotion to God, is dormant in the heart. It's the natural propensity is for us to love God, love and serve God. So sooner or later, that nature is going to come out.
Oh, so it's actually kind of a version of Universalism then. It teaches that sooner or later everyone's going to be, united with God. Or sorry if I'm using the wrong terminology, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah. The word universalism is fine. I mean, obviously, within the tradition we don't use that word, but within our tradition there hasn't been much philosophy of religion done. And even today in this movement, there's like me and a couple others that I'm aware of that are doing it, and I'm an electrician. My friend who's doing it is doing a PhD in religious studies, but he's getting more of a focus on philosophy of religion now. So, But yeah, the word universalism is fine. We're actually working on a paper at the moment where we respond to Talbot, Jerry Walls, and David Bentley Hart's views on heaven and hell and universalism. And we argue that reincarnation, this life being purgatory, is the best view of, I can't remember how we were phrasing it, compared to a best universalist view compared to David Bentley Hart, and also the argue for problems with Talbot's and Walls's view.
Huh. That's really cool. That's really interesting. And yeah, I think I've said it before that I think you can affirm Pascal's wager and be a universalist. But yeah, I mean, I guess your version gets complicated because everyone does ultimately get this infinite good. It's just that some people are slower than others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So somebody asked Prabhupada once, so, if I'm going to go back to Godhead eventually anyway, why should I practice Krishna consciousness now? And Prabhupada replied, why suffer unnecessarily?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, but I could just spend a few more lives in the material world trying to enjoy. And, one time a contemporary Hare Krishna guru was asked a similar question. He said, haven't you suffered enough?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, why spend more time suffering? Sure we could just, delay it and not take to God consciousness now and worry about it in a future birth. But maybe, if I say, I'll just enjoy this life and next life I'll go back to Godhead, maybe next life I'll forget all about it and I'll just, completely be in ignorance. And maybe I'll be in ignorance for 100 births. Now, while I've got this opportunity of this knowledge, I should take advantage of it and, get out of here. And another way it's argued is you've tried every kind of way of enjoying the material world. You've lived here for millions of births. It's described that if we could pile up all the bodies we've ever had where they were in the material world, they would reach to the sky.
Wow.
So Prabhupada would say, you've tried everything. Just give this one life to Sri Chaitanya.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that actually kind of relates back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of the stream, which is that, so take the combination of Hare Krishna is true, and I don't follow Hare Krishna, or I don't convert to Hare Krishna, or do what Hare Krishna religion teaches I should do. In that combination, because suffering is involved, things actually would be worse for you in this life. It's not just about the afterlife. So that does seem like, yeah, I mean, it kind of just relates to the kind of original version of the wager that you gave at the very beginning, and kind of like reaffirms that, because this life does matter for is it called Krishna consciousness, the Krishna consciousness wager?
Yeah, it's funny because like we don't have like, like the Christians, there's Christianity. You can become a Christian, you can practice Christianity, but we're kind of weird in Krishna consciousness because we're the Hare Krishna movement. We're Hare Krishnas, and we practice Krishna consciousness.
I see.
It's just, I mean, what are you going to say? We practice Hare Krishnaism, like these are all modern terms, right? So, Prabhupada called it the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. He didn't call it God consciousness because God consciousness is vague. God can mean so many different things. We mean Krishna. We mean the boy who plays a flute.
I see. Yeah. No, that's a helpful clarification. I've seen both Krishna consciousness and Hare Krishna, so. Yeah,
and sometimes we call it Bhakti Yoga. It depends, in different contexts. You might think, oh, people think Hare Krishna is a bunch of weirdos. So, I'll call myself a Chaitanya Vaishnava, and whenever I'm on my podcast, I'll say Chaitanya Vaishnavism, just so I don't, tick anybody's allergies to the Hare Krishna movement, or, when people do a preaching program, they might say, oh, we're doing Bhakti Yoga, or it's just different ways of packaging it, right? Whereas I'm like, oh, whatever, I'm just going to call it what people know it by. If they don't like it, then they can give their objections, and I'll give my responses, and we can talk about it.
Yeah, you were saying, is yoga a big part of the Hare Krishna religion?
We don't. I mean, yoga in terms of like calisthenics, not so much. That some people do it, but the yoga that is done on a yoga mat, that was something. The point of that was to make it so that you could sit down and meditate without your body disturbing you. So all the stretches and stuff was just to have a healthy body so you could meditate properly. We don't, the meditation is a process for a different yuga. We're a different age. We're in an age where there's so much distraction and whatnot that we can't possibly meditate as a method of going back to Godhead, of advancing spiritually, we chant God's holy names in congregation. So the yoga is not so important. But the word yoga actually means like it's related to the word yoke. I mean, it means to bind together, to union. So the meaning of the word yoga is to connect to God. So bhakti yoga means connecting to God through bhakti, and bhakti means devotion. Whereas you got karma yoga, which is offering the fruits of your labor to God, and jnana yoga, which is connecting to God through mental gymnastics, just engaging in knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like yoga, but I definitely do the physical one. Although I find meditating super helpful too. So that's cool.
So back to Pascal's wager, I've watched videos from Rationality Rules where he argues, gives various arguments against Pascal's wager, and one of his arguments, I can't remember which one it was. It's been a while since I looked at his videos. I mean, there's the argument from inconsistent revelation, which we answer with what I call universal principles theology. So it doesn't matter what the externals of the religion are. What matters is the content of what you're practicing, the basic philosophy of what you're following. So in that way, you could be a Muslim, a Christian, a Hare Krishna, and you get similar benefit. The other objection he offers is answered by saying you have to get some benefit in this life. So you're both better now, even if it's not true. I wish I probably should have watched this video more recently to help prepare for this. Maybe you're aware of the objections I'm talking about.
Yeah. So, I mean, the first one, I guess it's almost like there's a couple probably related ways of looking at it. One is just the basic many gods objection. Like, what do we say about these various religions? But there's also like a more specific version of that, which is like, so I actually call this the Homer Simpson objection, because Homer Simpson says, what if we are practicing the wrong religion or going to the wrong church? Every time we go to church, we're just making God madder and madder. So, you can, obviously that's not philosophically sophisticated as it could be, but the idea is that what if atheists and agnostics are kind of like neutral, but God would be really mad if you practice the wrong religion? It's kind of like if you are like separated from your spouse and they are like single versus if they're like seeing other people or something. I don't know. That's the best analogy I can come up with to support that thought. And I agree. I think your answer to that objection is a good one, which is like, look, there is a common core that a lot of religions prescribe really similar actions, whether that's, donating to charity, volunteering, giving to the poor, going to religious services, praying. These are things that are common to all religions. And so I think it's unlikely that God would see doing those things as somehow worse because you have the wrong religion than being an atheist or agnostic. I also think it's wrong to see atheism and agnosticism as neutral. Even if their life isn't centered around a religion, it's centered around something. And so just because you're not practicing a religion doesn't mean you don't have something that your life is centered around and even that you're worshiping. So I think that's a pretty good response to what you might call like the Homer Simpson objection.
A lot of those objections are situated in a dialectical context where they're responding to views which those objections are actually valid against. Like there are a lot of religious people in the world that think that everyone who's not a member of you get people who think that people, it's like, are people from other denominations going to hell? Yes. Even some people in my same church are going to hell. It's like, okay, great.
Yeah.
And you think
that's
God's
super
all loving.
intense. Yeah. No, I agree. I think there are even Christian denominations that are like, if you're a woman and you wear pants or if you drink alcohol, you're going to hell. And it's just like, yeah, I think those are very implausible claims, for sure.
You find Hare Krishnas like that too.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I guess the other thing you were saying, like one thing that's interesting. So in decision theory, there's different kinds of like rules you can make for how you make a decision. So one is called like expected value. And to do that, it's actually not that complicated, but it's this really basic not really basic, but it basically just involves multiplication and addition, where you take like the ways the world could be, and then you take the actions you could take, and then you multiply the probability that the world is a certain way times the value if you take an action given the world is that way. And this is actually like the reasoning behind the basic version of Pascal's wager. Like, look, if God exists and I believe in God, things are really good. If God exists and I don't believe in God, things are really bad. And then like either way, if God doesn't exist, things are finite. So looks like it's better to believe in God. That's one way you can kind of do the wager. But what you were sort of suggesting in that second comment is like, what if we did it instead like this? Well, let's say just take this action, like I believe in God, or you could say like I commit to this religion or whatever. Take that action, whether God exists or God doesn't exist, it's going to work out better for me either way. So even if I believe in God or commit to God and God doesn't exist, maybe I'll still be happier, healthier, have a certain amount of hope or whatever. Then instead of appealing to expected value reasoning, we can actually just do a simple dominance argument where you say, look, if I do this thing, then no matter what happens, it's always going to be a better outcome. So that's actually a principle in decision theory that we can use. And then one thing that's really nice about that is that things do get tricky when we have infinities and we're trying to multiply them by probabilities. There's like mathematical complications and just a lot of complications that come up. But if you just make it a dominance argument, a lot of that goes away because you're just like, look, it's better either way. I don't have to like multiply stuff by infinities. So I think that's kind of cool and can actually solve a bunch of technical problems that have gotten a lot of attention from philosophers.
Right. Yeah. One of the objections I think was that, because like the Homer Simpson one, if you take to the wrong religion, then you're worse off because you're making God madder and madder and madder. But
Yeah.
what we're assuming when we wager on God existing is that a perfect being exists. So, perfect being theism. And if you're going to assume a perfect being exists, well, what qualities would that being have or not have? And one of them, I think we could definitely say, is that one wouldn't have anger management problems or be a psychopath. So if we can rule out a psychopathic God, then we can no longer assume that this God might be somebody who would punish me for an eternity just because I got some externals wrong when I tried to take shelter of him and, happened to go to the wrong temple or the wrong synagogue or the wrong church.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I totally hear what you're saying. And also related to that too is like a lot of Christians don't even think God has emotions at all. I'm actually curious if that's also true for Hare Krishnas. But, there is a live debate among Christians about whether there's a hell. There's definitely a lot of Christian universalists, but there are people that try to defend hell as a outpouring of God's justice. And one possible view is that there is a hell, but there's only a small number of people in it, like Hitler and some really, really awful people. So, I don't want to, I guess I just think there are Christians that believe in hell. I don't want to fully rule that out, but I definitely agree that there's some really bad ways to defend hell and some really bad understandings of hell. I mean, another thing that Christians have talked about too is that hell may not be a place where God's just like actively punishing people and pouring out wrath, but it might be this like chosen separation from God. And I've heard Eleanor Stump put it like God is a gentleman. God's not going to force you to be in relationship with God or come to heaven without your consent. So again, I don't want to, make this about defending hell or not defending hell. And I'm not like one of those like strong, like there's definitely a hell kind of people. But I also think that, I want to give both sides a fair shake. So.
Right. Yeah, I would go further and say anyone who claims there's an eternal hell and claims God is all loving is making it has an inconsistent worldview.
Interesting. Yeah, and I mean I think that's a really interesting argument, and I'm not saying it fails. I just think there are some defenses of hell that you've even mentioned. You've interacted with some, but some philosophers have given various defenses of hell that I think are interesting and at least worth thinking about. How do you feel about annihilationism? I mean, I know that's not part of the Krishna consciousness view, but do you think that if God did annihilate people, even if it's that per impossible, would that mean that God's not perfect or all good?
So what is it? I call annihilationism cosmic eugenics. So
Mm.
obviously it's not identical to eugenics because, there's no genetics in the soul. But on annihilationism, what God's doing is destroying all the souls which don't have the qualities which he deems to be worthy of continued existence.
Mm.
Another problem with annihilationism is I feel like it's a nihilistic view of the human soul. So by that, I mean, on Krishna consciousness, the soul is good. The soul has bhakti naturally dormant in the heart, but we become conditioned by the material energy. We take on these bad qualities, but they're coverings over the soul, just like you take a crystal ball, you place it on a yellow surface and it becomes yellow. You place it on a green surface, it becomes green. The soul is like the soul enters a material body and it can take on anger, it can take on lust, greed, envy, illusion, madness, all sorts of bad qualities, but they're not part of the soul. The soul is underneath all of those. And you clean up the soul, you take all the dirt and grime off and scrub it up, and there's a beautiful living entity that was there all along underneath all the dirt.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that Christians would have different views on that. I mean, because one view that Christians have is that we're all deeply infected with sin and moral wrongdoing and moral badness. But Christians also teach that we're made in the image of God, and there's something, intrinsically valuable about persons. And so I think that you could maybe make a parallel argument that if souls or humans are intrinsically valuable, God would not destroy them. And then also, I think, interesting point, maybe God does send people to something like hell, but with the hope that they will repent and then they can come be with God in heaven. And so you could argue there's something more merciful about some kind of hell or purgatory than if they're just annihilated and they don't have a second chance. So obviously Christians will debate about whether once you're in hell, you can get out of hell. But if you can, then arguably that's maybe even more merciful than annihilationism. I think one of the best arguments for annihilationism, although this probably wouldn't affect the Krishna consciousness views, but if there is a hell and people in heaven are aware of that hell, it would seem to kind of put a damper on heaven. It's like, especially if you have friends and family there, it would seem like there's this like eternal dualistic thing of this really good place and this really bad place, and it would seem to make the really good place a lot worse. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So in Krishna consciousness, there's a strong emphasis on outreach, on, sharing Krishna consciousness with other people and, sharing the mercy and bringing as many people as possible back to Godhead. Of course, how you go about it determines whether that's a good quality or not.
Yeah.
You don't want to go around.
Totally. There is same with Christianity too. Yeah.
Like you can make the rules, and you could turn the process of Krishna consciousness into a bunch of rules and regulations, and then roll it all up and start using it as a bludgeon to go and smash people over the head with.
Yeah.
I like that, and that way of that metaphor for describing it, because it's kind of what happens when somebody gets too zealous with preaching. But there's so many stories. Like there's one story of Jayananda Prabhu, who left his body of cancer very early in the days of the Hare Krishna movement, but he was considered to be like a pure devotee. He did so much amazing service, was so selfless and dedicated. There's some fire out stories about him. His mother was in a hospice ward, dying, in old age or whatever she was dying of, and just by chance, the nurse that was there as she was dying was a Hare Krishna. And she remembered her son as a Hare Krishna, so she had someone chanting Hare Krishna to her as she died. So there is possibility to get mercy for your family members just by virtue of you being such a great devotee, without you needing to go and beat them over the head with the rules and regulations.
Yeah.
So compassion and prayer and concern over the destination of the souls of our loved ones is important in Krishna consciousness. We don't give that up. Only a really degraded, like anyone who's fit to go back to Godhead will have compassion for people they've had relationships with and want those people saved too. You won't have people going back to Godhead who think, oh, I don't care about these people. But there's some recourse, like it said that when you take shelter of a guru in Krishna consciousness, they will come back to the material world as many times as it takes to get you out of here. So, but repeated visits to the material world as an act of compassion, like people go to third world countries to do charity work. They're doing that because they get this. Not that I want to say there's something in it for them, but there's a kind of pleasure in helping other people. There's a kind of bliss or ecstasy in seeing another person suffering and being able to do something to reduce their suffering and carrying that out. So that's what I would have to say to that objection. That but at the same time, like there's infinite numbers of people suffering at all times. So to be saintly and do charity doesn't mean you never buy yourself a new pair of shoes ever, because you could use that extra $20 or $100 or whatever to feed 100 homeless people in Africa. Like that, there's somewhere where you draw the line. I mean, like we use karma and theodicy and all these answers to theodicy to explain why these people are suffering. We do what we can to reduce it, and then beyond that, we just say, well, it's out of my control. It is between God and these other people. But if someone's in front of you and hungry, then you do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a really interesting philosophical challenge in general, because it does seem like we have some obligations to help people, and Christianity teaches that, but I just think that's something everyone should agree on, but where do we draw that line? I think that's a super difficult and super interesting question, because for every person, there's another person you could save, so yeah, I agree with you that we don't want to make it so that we can't buy a new pair of shoes ever, right? But I do think it's challenging, because when you really think about it, you're like, well, I could buy this pair of shoes, or I could deworm a child, or I could give someone life-saving medicine. And, I mean, I don't have this all figured out. I do think there's some real puzzles there. When have we gone above and beyond our moral duty? If we have some duty to help, where does that threshold lie? So I think that's a really big and interesting philosophical puzzle.
I think in a more traditional life setting, it wouldn't be such a big problem, because now with globalism, I can do something about people suffering on the other side of the planet. Whereas traditionally in a agrarian society where there's just kind of a local village, not like major cities, there was like the local, widow, maybe, the local orphans, the local homeless men, and he could come to your door and ask you. Like in India, there's chapatis, which is a little like bread they fry in a pan, a bit like a wrap. And people got the mendicants. They might be saintly people, or they might just be homeless people. They go door to door, and they might beg one chapati from each house. So if all you take is one chapati from each house, that house is not worse off, really. If you eat an entire meal at one house, then you're costing them something. So they would go door to door and have a little bit at each house. And in this way, there's this culture of feeding people. And so nobody went hungry, but at the same time, nobody was unable to do the then equivalent of buying new shoes just because they're helping other people. So I think like in more agrarian British culture, there was more local charity and, like not from the government, but just from each other. If somebody was in need, people would help that person out. But now with globalism, we can't possibly help everyone who we come across.
Yep. And it also seems too that if there are people suffering and going through really horrible things, proximity doesn't seem that relevant to me. Like just because they're on a different continent or in a different country, if I have the ability to help them, it doesn't seem relevant that they're really far away from me. So yeah, I actually am a big fan of, I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's called effective altruism. And the idea is that we should take our resources and help other people and also try to do it in the most effective way that we can. I really like what you're saying. And one thing I like about what you're saying is that everyone kind of does their part. Everyone in the village provides a little bit of food, but not so much food that it's hurting them. And then a huge question comes up, which is like, what if other people aren't doing their fair share? Do I need to then do more than my fair share? And like, maybe in some cases you should if someone's life is at stake. But again, it goes back to that original puzzle I was talking about, like, where do we draw the line? And I totally agree that this just all gets so much more complicated, in that I could just send money to some charity right now and then they could go help people on a different continent, and everything's just so much more global and so much more connected. So things are complicated, but at the same time, it's cool. When you look at statistics, it does seem like poverty is getting better. That's one thing that's really encouraging. Another thing that's really encouraging is that there's a lot of charities that are really concerned with helping the most people that they can, partially because of this philosophical movement called effective altruism. So I think that's really awesome.
Yeah, I like that idea too. I mean, like I give some charity to a charity in India where like it's the people running it basically, you know, there's like no admin costs. It's pretty much all going to people on the ground. They clean up holy places in Vrindavan, but they pay widows and people that wouldn't otherwise have employment that live locally in these holy places to do it. So they're helping all these widows be able to feed their children and so on. And so it's a really effective use, you know, like $20 of New Zealand money might feed you know, 40 meals or something, whereas if $20 here it might be 4 meals in New Zealand.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also like thinking about economic considerations is important here too. Like I'm not an expert on this, but there's some evidence that like microloans for small businesses rather than just handouts are like more sustainable and do more good in the long run. And so there's a lot of really interesting research that I don't know a ton about, although I will recommend this podcast. It's called the 80,000 Hours Podcast, and they talk a lot about effective altruism and like some of the relevant research here that I really, really enjoy that podcast. So if you or your listeners are interested in kind of effective altruism, and then they do kind of like economics, philosophy, those kinds of people, they have a lot of, you know, people that are knee deep in the research on that podcast. And I really enjoy it. It's super informative. The interviews are like 2 to 4 hours long sometimes though. So you gotta buckle up, but it's cool.
Right. We can put a link for that in the description or in the comments. Maybe we should,
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, that whole charity question is complicated. Maybe we should bring it back to Pascal's wager. So you brought that up because of the universalism, and what about the fact that we could be in heaven and people we know could be in hell? So at least you could get your family members and friends that you know personally back to heaven, and maybe once those people are in heaven, they'll be like, oh, but what about my family members and friends? And you know, that way, if we each do our own little bit, like, you know, it might be the answer to these complicated charity questions are, well, you should give enough charity that if everybody gave, or, you know, if say 70% of the world or the people who are capable of giving charity gave as much as you're giving, or even if 50% gave that much, then there would be no poverty in the world. And that's enough. You know, if you just give enough that if 50% of the people who are capable of doing it did what you're doing, then everyone would be fine. That's enough, because one person can't fix everything, but at least we can be part of the solution.
Yeah, no, I like that. I think there's different ways you can kind of try to draw that line. And one thing this guy named Garrett Colity talks about is like, we're helping people so they can have life projects and goals and good relationships with their family and meals and celebrations and holidays. And it's kind of silly if we're giving up literally all of that in order to help them, because that's what we're helping them for, is so they can do these good things and they can live life to the fullest. And so, yeah, we should give a lot, but we shouldn't give to the point where we're sacrificing the things that we want to help them get to, if that makes sense. So it's related in that it's kind of trying to put a threshold on where we should go. The other thing I want to say is I actually think that effective altruism isn't totally unrelated to Pascal's wager, because effective altruists, I know it sounds silly, but effective altruists focus a lot on small probabilities of big things happening. So they're actually like interested in things like, what do we say about the super long-term future, or like a small probability of like a worldwide nuclear war, or, you know, these small probability things, or like, you know, runaway artificial intelligence, you might. And I think this is interesting because this is actually kind of what Pascal's wager itself is appealing to. It's saying, look, even if there's like a small probability these, you know, this certain religion or these religions are true, look at how much you could gain or lose by practicing that religion. You know, these have infinite afterlives, or, you know, infinite irrelevant outcomes. And so the style of argument that effective altruists often give is similar to the style of argument that is actually involved in Pascal's wager. Maybe that's one reason I like effective altruism. Right. So anyway, there are connections, even though we are kind of getting off of Pascal's wager. I think there are important connections.
It makes sense that both of them, you'd find both of them interesting, because both of them are focused on the greatest welfare for the largest number of people in some sense.
Yeah, or some version of consequentialism, even if it's not utilitarianism in particular. Although you're right, a lot of effective altruists probably would be sympathetic to utilitarianism. But it's interesting, like if you are a decision theorist, that at least fits the best with some kind of consequentialism. But I will also say this, consequentialism is a very flexible theory because you can build whatever you want into the consequences. So you can build being a virtuous person or some kind of religious consequence or, lots of different things. So, but yeah, you're totally right that there's some kind of consequentialism that seems to be in the air, at least.
I hadn't even thought about it through that lens. I mean, I don't see how you'd have Pascal's wager without a focus on consequences.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's partially just because consequences is a pretty broad term, but you don't have to be a utilitarian to accept Pascal's wager. But yeah, it's definitely focusing on consequences and long-term consequences. And one thing about Pascal's wager too is it depends on the version of the wager you're going in for. And maybe some of the versions where we were talking about that really more focus on dominance arguments, this wouldn't be a problem for. But one thing that the wager does want you to focus on is not just the immediate outcome, but the really long-term, costs and benefits of what you're doing today. So if you had a situation where you really just only cared about the next couple of years and then you just don't care anymore, which interestingly, economists have shown that a lot of us tend to have those preferences, whether they're actually rational or not. Not that we don't care anymore, but we just tend to prioritize the immediate over the long term. Pascal's wager, at least a lot of versions of it, especially those that really focus on the afterlife, they tend to say, look, no, we need to focus on these long-term consequences, not just the immediate future. Interestingly, so do effective altruists. And there's a whole branch of effective altruists. They're called long-termists. And the whole point of long-termism is that we need to be really focusing a lot on the long-term future of humanity, these future generations, what kind of world we're making for them. And so it's super interesting, all these different parallels. I find it fascinating, at least.
Because we might be taking birth as our great-grandchildren, right? So we should create a better world.
Yeah. You could take a reincarnation angle on it too.
Right. Somebody was asking about the idea that hell is locked from the inside. I think this relates to, I might as well bring this up since we've been talking about it. So I did a summary of Jerry Walls's arguments for the existence of eternal hell. I can't remember how we described it, the idea that hell's not empty.
Yeah.
So what I wrote is, Walls argues that hell is not something created by God to punish depraved souls, but rather that the state known as hell is the necessary and intrinsic consequence of the attitude and decisions made by the depraved. A question which Walls's position faces is, why don't the damned figure out that their decisions are causing them great suffering and rectify their ways? Walls answers this question by saying that the suffering in hell is not bad enough to cause them to change, and the damned experience a distorted kind of pleasure in their envy of God and self-aggrandizement. Does that sound like an accurate summary of Jerry Walls's views to you? I don't know if you've studied this.
I actually haven't read that book before.
Right.
But I do know, I know that he defends that, obviously. But yeah, that's really interesting. So what do you say in response to that?
So that basically expands on C.S. Lewis's comment that the doors of hell are locked from the inside. So when we were researching who to respond to in our papers, C.S. Lewis is mentioned. Everyone's quoting C.S. Lewis, but C.S. Lewis wasn't doing philosophy of religion in a modern analytic way, so it's better to respond to Jerry Walls, who's basically arguing his stuff in a modern context. So just what I'd say back to that is, I think David Bentley Hart's view actually responds to that beautifully. So I wrote a summary of my attempt to summarize David Bentley Hart's response last night, actually. So David Bentley Hart argues that our free will cannot be used to defend eternal existence in hell because free will is always oriented towards the good. David Bentley Hart describes free will as a combination of rationality and an orientation towards the good. The orientation towards the good can take us down dark paths simply because we can be mistaken about what the good is or how to reach it. But we can't be mistaken in this way eternally. Sooner or later, we will realize that what we're doing is not bringing us towards the good, and we will look elsewhere. Eventually, we will turn to God.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess I'm curious what your thoughts are, but I guess I'm thinking we do choose what we think is good, but sometimes we're wrong about what's good. And also sometimes we're just straight up irrational. So we might say, look, it's better if I don't eat 3 pieces of chocolate cake tonight, but we might do it anyway because we just give in to temptation. I also think, again, people just do things that are dumb and irrational sometimes. So yeah, I guess like it depends on how much credit you want to give people, I guess. And like I'm not saying that the response itself totally fails, but there's like probably relative, like, different positions you can take on how rational people are, or how inclined to the good they are. But I don't know if I would go quite as far as Hart would, but I'm curious what you think about that.
So I like the cake example. So with the cake example, and in Indian traditions, there's this term prayas and shreyas. So prayas means the immediate good, immediate benefit, and shreyas means ultimate good. So in terms of like the cake example, we could draw an analogy and say eating the cake now is prayas, immediate benefit. Or another example might be studying in university rather than going to the beach. So going to the beach is prayas, it's immediate gratification, whereas studying gives you a better future. But what we really mean by shreyas is the eternal benefit. So that's kind of what we're getting at with Pascal's wager when we say you'll get an ultimate good. You'll return back home, back to Godhead, and be situated in the material world and the spiritual world with a spiritual body in Krishna's pastimes, where there's no suffering. Relating that back, so you can choose when you're choosing to eat the cake, even though it's not the rational thing to do. There's a kind of good in the cake. There's a pleasure that comes from eating the cake. So your part of you is driven towards the cake because the cake has a perverted reflection of a pleasure that's found in the spiritual world. There's a Shakti of Krishna in that cake, which is why you're attracted to it. But what's more rational is to go to a more pure form of that, and like to go directly to Krishna rather than to find it in the material world where because for example, our main process is the chanting of God's holy names. So you can chant God's holy names all day long. You can completely immerse yourself in chanting God's holy names. You can do kirtan, like singing in congregation of God's holy names all the time. You can share it with other people. It's never diminished, and you're not gonna have any negative consequences. It's not like overeating or other kinds of things.
Yeah, but I guess maybe I agree with a lot of what you said. I just don't know if it answers the objection to hell, the gates of hell being locked from the inside, because the idea is that maybe these people somewhere deep down in their heart of hearts even know that like being with God would be better, but they're just choosing the cake rather than the long-term good. The cake is their stubbornness or their inability to admit that, God's power or goodness or their own pride or whatever it is. And so to me, it seems consistent with the gates of hell being locked from the inside. As long as you don't think people are perfectly rational or always choose the long-term good, it does seem like sometimes we just choose the lesser good or the short-term good. So anyway.
So that might be true if it weren't for reincarnation. So if we lived in the same bodies eternally, so, you could become grumpy and stubborn, because as people get older, they tend to become more and more set in their ways and more stubborn. Then they may never change. But because we have everything taken away from us at death and then have to start again in a new body with new parents, new life lessons, and, become zero in a sense, where you have nothing, you're humbled, you're completely dependent on your parents, you're in all sorts of humiliating situations, and you get different samskaras. You completely forget about your past self. You bring your general attitudes with you, and some degree of propensities and attractions and aversions, but a lot of your stuck in their ways thought patterns, that a lot of that's connected with the brain, and that's destroyed. You get a new brain, the brain's wired again. That happens repeatedly. A new brain, get to wire the brain again from scratch, and that gives you a chance to break out of these ways, and discover new ways of being, new ways of thinking.
So reincarnation makes you more rational or something?
Well, it stops you from getting stuck in a rut.
Yeah. I see. So the thought is that the person, who's locked in hell with the lock right in front of him or her, as they're reincarnated, they'll start to see that differently or something.
Yeah,
Is
I
that
mean, people take
yeah.
birth in different bodies. That they get put in different situations. In this life you might be rich, in the next life you might be poor. Uh,
Yeah.
all sorts of differences, and these give you opportunities to see things in different ways. So, the rich man who's really mean to the poor and stuck in his ways, now he gets to be poor and see how horrible it is to be treated badly by
Hmm.
rich people, and then they figure out, oh,
Yeah.
actually, maybe it's not nice to treat poor people badly.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and I don't know if Walls was considering reincarnation specifically, but it's interesting to think more about how, well, I just don't know as much about reincarnation, so it's interesting to learn, but also how that sort of interacts with these different theological arguments. So that's cool.
I don't know if this relates to Pascal's wager or not, but it's fun to talk about.
We've been talking about stuff that's related and kind of related, but it's been good. It's been good.
Knowing you'll find a way that it's related. I don't think I was going to be bringing this up today. Anyway, it's good to talk about. I might get some comments that might help us with the paper or something. Someone in the comments is saying they're more of an ice cream guy, though. But all this talk of cake's making them hungry.
I agree, actually. I am more into ice cream than cake. Yeah, we had our wedding celebrations last month, and Alex's mom basically forced us to get a cake because Alex and I both aren't into cake. And then everyone ate the cake and it was all gone. So I was like, it was probably good we got a cake. But yeah, we both eat a lot more ice cream than we eat cake. Anyway.
Right. I'm wondering where we should go next. Have you got any thoughts?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, we have been going for an hour and 15 minutes, right? So
I usually go for 2 hours, but we could wrap it up if you want.
Oh, you usually go for 2 hours? Dang. You're like it's like the 80,000 Hours podcast.
2 hours isn't long. I don't know. I'm kind of modeling things off Capturing Christianity. He does 2-hour streams, 2-hour debates and stuff. It's 2 hours is good.
Yeah.
I mean, I listen to things at double speed anyway, so 2 hours isn't much to get through.
Yeah. What if we did 15 more minutes? Would that be okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. My wife will be
okay.
happy with
I don't want to cut you off, but I also we actually are totally out of food, so I need to get some groceries before the grocery store closes.
Oh, right. What time is it over there?
It's 7:15.
Oh, right.
So a lot of stores close at 9.
Right.
So that would give me an hour, maybe 10. But yeah. I'm trying to think if there's other things related to Pascal's wager or objections that we could talk about. I don't know. How much does the Krishna consciousness, how much do proponents of Krishna consciousness emphasize belief? I know, at least in the Christian case, a lot of the objections to Pascal's wager are about you can't believe it will, or that would make belief irrational. How central is belief to Hare Krishna's?
Oh yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Actually, that is an interesting difference. I've heard Radhika Raman Prabhu, also known as Dr. Ravi Gupta, who's a great scholar in our tradition. He's got a head of philosophy of religion at some university in America. He was describing that in Christianity, or maybe the Abrahamic traditions in general, you have this obsession with belief. I think it's pretty common that Christians will rank the quality of someone's Christianity by the strength of their conviction and the truth of certain propositions.
Yeah.
Does that sound accurate?
Yeah. I don't like it, but as a descriptive claim, that is unfortunately true. Yeah.
Whereas,
yeah.
So, a Christian meets somebody from another religion or meets another Christian, and the first question might be, so what do you believe?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the Indian traditions, and in India, one Indian meets another Indian, and the question will be, what are your practices? What do you do?
Interesting.
How do you live your life? So there's more of a focus on lifestyle and application. So, for example, in Krishna consciousness, that perhaps more than any other religion on the scene, we ask more of our practitioners. So there's 4 regular principles. We chant 16 rounds of the Hare Krishna mantra every day. And of course, we're expected to study the teachings, but we don't just have one book. We've got, the Bhagavatam. I think it's 18 cantos, and some of the cantos are 4 volumes, four books this thick. And
wow.
There's the Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, which is I can't remember how many books that is. It depends which printing you get of it too. But basically I don't even think my arms will fit.
Wow.
Have to cut. Like.
So have you read all that? That seems like so much.
Well, I listened to it as audio. I should probably go through it again, but I've more or less gone through it once. But then I probably spend more time listening to philosophy of religion debates and podcasts than I should, and I should spend more time studying the theology, which I'm up here defending.
Both are good. But yeah, I really like listening to the Bible. It definitely, reading is fine too, but sometimes you can just kind of get through more, and it's like a different way of sort of absorbing it, I guess. So I don't know. But especially when, I didn't realize they had that much holy writing. That's quite a bit. So I don't blame you for listening to some of it at least. But yeah, that's really interesting.
I'm a terrible reader. I read almost nothing. All of my content is consumed through listening. If somebody sends, I need to read a book. Now I have a revolution how I can get through books, because I put it on Amazon Polly, which has AI text to speech. So Jerry Walls' book, which I was quoting, I convert it to AI text to speech, listen to it on my phone. If I want to find a quote I like, then I just write down bookmark it, and then search keywords in the text, find it, and then I can quote it.
Yeah, no, that's great. I definitely do a lot of that too. I feel like, especially when part of your job is publishing, you can get so bogged down in doing all the readings that you never even get to the writings. And so I like shortcuts like this. I do a lot of like skimming of articles, or like reading the introduction and the conclusion and the abstract. But I think listening is also a really good way to get content. And like, I was amazed. I was meeting people. I went to the Capturing Christianity conference last month, and I was meeting people that like never read and just did YouTube stuff, and they were so smart and educated. And I was just like, wow. But it's true. You can find so much on YouTube, and you can learn so much. It's almost like the new reading. maybe that's, someone probably hates me for saying that, but but you can get so much knowledge from YouTube stuff, which I think it's great. So anyway.
A really good intellectual can, if you listen to enough of their lectures, you almost don't need to read their book, but you do get more out of reading their book. And a person who's written a book can give better lectures than a person who hasn't written a book. So books definitely have value.
I guess I should clarify my statement. I'm not saying that like you shouldn't go and read people's work. And I will say, in my case, for example, a lot of it is kind of giving a summary of it and giving a few examples. And I think, you can get the gist of a lot of it, and you can kind of cover more ground, like breadth wise. But I do think actually going and reading the stuff, or like listening to an audiobook or something, gives you that depth and that like kind of deeper understanding. So maybe I should qualify and not just say like reading is pointless or only listen to YouTube. But but I guess on the other hand, it's cool how much information is on YouTube and how many scholars you can find. And one thing I really like about it is like, I'm really passionate about making philosophy of religion not just something that philosophers are aware of or talking about, but something that like everyday people can learn about, and it's accessible for them. And they're probably not going to go, maybe you would, but like some non-professionals won't go and like read a journal article or read an academic book. And so what's great about YouTube is it's making that more accessible to people. So I really, that's one reason I do so much YouTube stuff. I think that's really important.
Yeah, definitely. What Joe Schmidt's doing with Majesty of Reason is amazing, where he like publishes an article and then does a 4-hour video on it. And it's pretty dense. You've got to find the content interesting. I was kind of amused when he told me that he considers his YouTube channel to be popular level. I'm like, yeah, I suppose, but like, I think Rationality rules is more popular level, and your stuff is maybe middle between that and, anyway, you got to be really absorbed in the subject to get into Majesty of Reason. But if you are, then his stuff's gold.
Yeah, for sure. And I think another thing that's nice about YouTube is there's different like levels. Like some of the stuff is very introductory. Some of the stuff goes deeper, but it's more conversational. Some of the stuff just is really long and deep and intense, And so there's like a spectrum of different interviews. And like, I don't know if you ever listened to The Analytic Christian. One thing I really like about that channel is that I do think it's accessible, but Jordan is really, really focusing on a paper that someone wrote and going through that paper. And I think that's like a different spin on the way to do YouTube, where it's not just like kind of shooting the shit or whatever, but it really gives you like a sense of like what the main moves are in that paper and what's going on in that paper. So that's valuable, maybe in a different way.
We should throw links for all the stuff in the comments. Yeah, his channel's good. Analytic Christian's good because he'll do like one topic. So it'll be one video that's like 30 or 45 minutes long, or maybe an hour, but it's one topic. So like, if you're curious about a topic, or you want to know how to respond to certain arguments, or want to know what people are saying on a certain topic, you can go and click on that and hear about that topic. Whereas you come on my channel and I'll tell you it's Pascal's wager, and we'll end up talking about the problem of evil and charity.
But we're bringing it all back. And speaking of bringing it back, I wanted to say something about the belief thing, because I think it's really interesting. That like the Christian emphasis on belief, I think, has made this belief objection this big problem. At least a lot of people see it as this big problem for Pascal's wager. But I think Christians are too obsessed with belief. And even if belief is important, or important in some cases, it can't be all that matters. Like, God cares about our actions too, even just focusing on Christianity, right? That's, the Bible even says that, like, even demons believe and shudder. It's not just about belief, right? But I also think it's really interesting because a lot of these objections just totally evaporate if you only make it about action. If you make it about a commitment, about practicing a religion, about seeking a relationship with God, then I really think, look, that is clearly something you have control over, and that's not something that's epistemically irrational. And so I think these objections have come up often because of misconceptions about what various religions teach, than anything else.
Oh yeah, so back on the belief thing, and then we can wrap it up.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is a big difference, but it's not that we place no importance in belief. So belief is important in my mind, my understanding, in as much as it affects your attitude towards God. So if you believe God's evil and is trying to punish you, then you can't really develop love of God. So, but like, there's certain things that are debated, which I think are somewhat inconsequential, like arguing that are actually just arguing how many angels you can fit on the head of a pin, which is like, this has no bearing, like, whether the number is 10 or 11, I'm still going to dedicate my life to serving God. So obviously I could give examples when people will say, no, that is important. That does matter for your devotion. And, we should debate which things are important. I'm not saying there shouldn't be a debate about it, but the general idea is some things are real side issues. But some things do actually matter for your attitude. But the real focus is developing love of God. So you could, like Prabhupada said that you can measure the quality of a religion by how successful it is in developing love of God and its followers. Now, you find a wide diversity of belief among various religions. So that would imply that your beliefs are not so important. Although maybe within a certain tradition, you have license to believe things within that tradition. So as a Hare Krishna, if I believed things that Hare Krishna believes, which are contradictions of the teachings of Bhagavad Gita and Bhagavatam, that might be a problem. But if I'm a Christian and I believe those things, maybe that's fine. So, like almost within a family structure, like within a family, there's certain things you do and certain things you don't do. And those children are raised well. In another family, they've got a different way of doing things, and those children are always also raised well. But if you mix parenting styles, and you get half hen logic, where you take half of a parenting style from one parenting style and the other half from another thing, like you take the firmness from one side and leave out the lovingness, then and add some other aspect instead of the lovingness from a different parenting style, then you're going to have problems. And the problem of belief is also, the way they argue it is, well, you can't choose your beliefs. Like I couldn't believe that I was made out of platinum if I wanted to, or whatever examples people give of things that you couldn't believe if you wanted to, because it's not true. Graham Oppy says if you wanted to believe there's some roses in a vase on a table, all you have to do is get some roses in a vase and put it on the table. So you can control your beliefs.
I like that example.
But within the context of theism, I think there's a lot of data to show that you surround yourself by people who have certain beliefs. You do the practices that people who have those beliefs are doing. You read the things that those people are believing, and sooner or later you'll end up believing as they believe. Maybe you could call it irrational, but maybe it is rational. Maybe you figured out that that's a belief you want to have. You've got reason to think maybe it's true, but you know that it's beneficial to have that belief, so you want to get it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that people fail to realize is that we're all indoctrinating ourselves in certain ways based on who we hang out with and what we read and don't read and the political views of our friends and family and, all this stuff. And so I feel like to criticize someone for joining a community because they think it would be a really good thing if, what that community teaches were true. I think that's just a general phenomenon that all of us, to some extent, we're not getting perfectly balanced evidence for every single possible view. So that's one thing to say. But yeah, and I also think too, people do tend to conflate the do you just have control objection over whether this is rational objection. So, this clearly we do have control. Then it's a whole nother ball game to talk about what's rational and what's irrational. And I really think it's so complicated, especially when you're not just making it. I mean, some epistemologists think what's rational is following the evidence you have at a certain time, right? So it's not like this thing where you have to gather evidence in this way or that way, but it's really just about following your current evidence. Some people think that's really what it is. When we talk about how we should gather evidence responsibly, I think things just get really complicated, partially because some truths are way more important than other truths, partially because we don't have infinite time or infinite cognitive resources. So yeah, I think connecting Pascal's wager up with some of this literature on norms for inquiry and how we should gather evidence would be really interesting, but that's also going to sort of depend on the version of Pascal's wager you're going in for as well. So
cool.
Yeah.
So maybe we can wrap it up there. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was cool to kind of learn more about the Krishna consciousness, religion, and their beliefs and how that interacts with Pascal's wager. So this was a really good time.
Cool. Thanks again. And if you like this kind of content, be sure to like and subscribe. I think I've linked Liz Jackson's channel in the description. She's also got a website. So you can check out her stuff if you want to know more. She's done lots of other podcasts on related topics. I'll leave it there. Hare Krishna. Oh, play the outro video. Hang on.